Hi, everyone. Welcome to Why Are Women Always Talking to Men in Novels, a conversation about debiasing books using data analytics. I'm Monique Manjan, the project manager at BookNet Canada, and I have now the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Andrew Piper. Andrew is the professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at McGill University. He's the director of Text Lab, where he uses data science to better understand literature and culture, and the author most recently of Enumerations, Data and Literary Studies. His work has been profiled in The Guardian, The Atlantic, The New Republic, Le Devoir, Real Simple, and on the CBC. So without further ado, I'll pass things off to Andrew.
All right, so the topic for today, here's my information if you want to learn more about me. There we go. As Monique was saying, I am a professor at McGill University. I direct a laboratory called Text Lab, a laboratory for cultural analytics, where we try and use techniques of natural language processing, machine learning, to understand literature and culture, and also to think about how to promote more inclusive and open ideas about culture and creativity. My preferred avatar is Wall-E for social media for obvious reasons. These are some of the pamphlets that students have produced over the years in our lab, and as they relate to questions of bias and cultural bias. You'll notice very quickly that my PowerPoint slides are so bad that even the PowerPoint AI doesn't know what to do with me, so bear with me on that front. One of the things I'm going to do is also during the talk is later on is mention a tool that I want to mention early on in case some of you drop out later called Granthinka. It's a software platform that's been designed by the creative writer Vikram Chandra at the University of California at Berkeley. He's a well-known creative writer. He's the author of Sacred Games. Maybe some of you know it. It was made into a Netflix series as well. And we partnered up recently to begin to add some metrics and analytics to the platform. When I started presenting to BookNet a couple of years ago, the first question I always got was, well, is there a tool we can use to kind of help address these issues? And the answer then was no, but recently now we have something to begin to share with you. So I just wanted to let you know about that, that I'll be talking about that later up front. Okay, so the topic for today is bias and debiasing books. And the first important point I want to make is that this is not a conversation that I started, but that you've started. This is something that's been going on for the last couple of years in the industry. There are lots of examples of trying to think about the diversity of publishers' lists, the diversity of authors. BookNet has done surveys on this issue to identify new market opportunities, new readerships, new genre opportunities, and so forth. And the point I want to make is that typically this is seen as an author or title issue, right? About adding new authors, new kinds of titles to your lists in order to meet both market and ethical demands out in the marketplace. The point I want to add into this conversation is that diversity is also a content issue as well. And that data analytics can be a very useful tool for thinking about content and for thinking about content in particular as it relates to bias. Okay, so that's going to be one of my key focuses for today. So what do I mean by bias? It's really important. This is a very complex concept. It can mean many things to many different people in many different contexts. So it's really important when you start down this road that you have a clear understanding of what you mean by this term and how you're going to apply it. For me personally, the way I'm going to use it today and in the work in the lab is we think of bias as any feature of a book that predictably adheres to norms that maintain social hierarchies. And I draw this definition, I'll unpack this in a second, but I draw this definition from a really interesting recent paper by the group in the lower right of the slide on Language Technology as Power, a critical survey of bias in NLP. And it's very useful reading, and it's relatively accessible to lay readers. So this definition of bias makes bias have three important qualities. The first is that it's relational. So we're talking about features that adhere to norms with respect to some kind of norm. That is to say, these are features that have qualities that are related to something else in the world that we're measuring it against. And this also makes bias measurable. That is to say, bias is something that happens predictably, in repeated fashion, in patterned ways that we can detect and we can observe. And finally, bias in this sense is also perceptual and normative. It's drawing on normative reasoning. It's saying we see these norms and we relate these norms to values that we have, and we want to change them in some way. So in this particular case, we identify bias as a problem when it maintains social hierarchies, when it maintains social and cultural inequality. And it's important to see that as a norm against which we are working and towards which we're moving. Okay, so what kinds of bias are in there inside of these books? What happens when we look? So I'm going to talk about a couple different kinds of bias. And the first one I'm going to talk about is stylistic. And this is the most straightforward. You can think of this as, one example of this is good old-fashioned overused words and cliches. And it'll become clear in a couple of slides why this is valuable for thinking about questions of social bias and social hierarchy. An example of stylistic bias would be James Patterson has a habit of using the words said and get and got a lot. Okay. And how much more? So we can measure this, and we can observe that Patterson in his novels uses the verb said about 4 times more often than your average novel. And that might be a problem worth addressing if we wanted to improve the style of Patterson's novels. Not to pick on him, but he's successful enough; he can handle it. Here's another example. So in Kafka's work, and I'm a Germanist by training, so whenever I need an example, I often like to use Kafka because I'm a big Kafka fan. So for the Kafka fans out there, the overused words in Kafka are words like but, probably, perhaps. Now, if you are a reader of Kafka, you'll know that these words are really crucial to creating Kafka's very strange universes that he has in his novels. There are the rules and how you navigate these worlds is really contingent and confusing and hard to understand. And so language like, well, maybe, perhaps, admittedly, freely, sure, okay, but of course, this all goes to creating that sort of uncertain certainty that goes into Kafka's worlds. So when we think about these issues, we want to fix one of these problems, right? We might want to think about the stylistic bias in Patterson. We probably don't want to change Kafka's novels because that bias is part of his art. So the important point here is that these are predictable behaviors with respect to some norm. Remember, it's Patterson's using this word with respect to your average novel. And then our perception of that value, whether it's positive or negative, is tied to our own values, whether those are institutional, organizational, or personal. Some other features of stylistic bias we might think about and that we can currently measure and address are overused words that I've talked about, sentence length, repetitiveness, also difficulty in terms of the text readability. This could be something valuable if you're thinking about reaching particular audiences. So you're writing books for children or middle school books, or you're targeting a young adult audience. There, the difficulty of your text is going to be very important to meeting your readers where they are, or potentially challenging them at certain occasions. So knowing those norms can be a valuable way of assessing where you are stylistically. The next form of social bias I'm going to talk about is social bias. So this relates more closely to our definition, and a lot of this is drawn on research that I began presenting with Eve Kreiser, who you may remember we were co-presenters a couple of years back. And she's gone on to do some amazing work in AI and ethics in the field, and is leading a conference this week, as a matter of fact. So I know she isn't here today, but I have a feeling she'll be watching this later on. But she was an early ally and leader in this area of research in our lab, and so I'm really appreciative of the work that she did for us. And so in this piece, which you can find in the Journal of Cultural Analytics and also on our pamphlets on our website, one of the things we detected, we tried to measure and predict the gender of characters in a set of about over 1,000 novels, looking at about 26,000 characters. And what we found in doing so is that about 38% of characters were predicted to be women. Now, finding characters in books and predicting their gender, this is what we call non-trivial task computationally. It's pretty easy and obvious when you read a book who the characters are, but if you've never read a book and you're a machine, teaching a machine to find characters is actually quite challenging. But we kind of incorporate the uncertainty into our estimates. But we think this is about a decent prediction of what you might find if you look at a group of novels. Now, for you math buffs out there, you'll notice that that ratio is about 0.4 percentage points off of what we call the golden ratio. And the golden ratio is technically listed as when the ratio of the larger quantity, the ratio of two quantities is the same as the ratio of the larger quantity to the sum. So A is to B as A plus B is to A. Now, why is this interesting? Well, because it's often thought that the golden ratio represents a very pleasing aesthetic experience in nature or in art for human beings. What's interesting about it is that what we find is that this ratio that we're seeing of gender distribution in novels mirrors a whole bunch of other cultural practices. It's a really sticky number and kind of a ceiling in many ways. So, for example, studies have looked at the distribution of gender across artists in music, and it's about 31% of artists are estimated to be women in Billboard Top 100 songs. When we looked at the history of Hollywood screenplays over the last 50 years, we found that about 30% of the words were apportioned to women characters in those movies. And someone did a study on academic talks and looked at over a couple thousand academic talks over the course of a year and found that about 31% of the invited talks were given to women academics. You can see the way that there's something going on here to maintain a sense of harmony and equilibrium socially that relies on a social hierarchy. Right? That's why we're interested in this mathematical proportion here. Seems to be culturally constant and problematic. Interestingly, when we were doing the study, we found that main characters were kind of eerily balanced, right around 50%. So when you look at 1,000 novels, that's what we found, and these are all hand reviewed. It's important to see the difference between these numbers. Right? So we assume that editors and publishers can keep a pretty close eye on protagonists, and when they do so, they create gender balance. When they can't look exactly, right? When you can't observe all characters in books just by hand, we revert and fall back to these norms. So I think that's where data analytics really becomes valuable when you're looking at phenomena that are so widespread. They're harder to track with just our naked eye. To refer to the title of my talk talks about why are women always talking to men in novels. One of the things we found that was also particularly interesting was that when you look at the way characters interact in novels, of who's connected to whom as a sort of social network problem, they're biased strongly towards connecting men and women in novels. So for that graph on the right, I won't go into it. Assortativity is just a way of measuring the likelihood that people of the same group are connected in the network. So the degree to which, I see in my screen, the y-axis is plotted out by people's names. So if you can't see that, the further up you go in the graph, the more same gender the interactions are, and the further down you go, the more mixed gender. So being below that red line means that most novels are overwhelmingly skewed towards relationships, prioritizing relationships between men and women as opposed to between men or between women. And when we run like permutation tests to test just how strong this is effective, randomly sorting characters, you never find these levels of what we see disassortativity happening. And so it suggests that there's a real kind of, whether it's conscious or unconscious, there's a real signaling effect happening in novels to immerse readers in what we call these heteronormative worlds, establishing, again, norms about relationships. And what that does is it occludes other kinds of relationships from taking center stage. The next kind of bias I'm going to talk about is representational bias. And this is what you can think of as a combination of social and stylistic. So coming back to those stylistic measures, it's one thing to count characters, right? It's one thing to measure the distribution of characters. It's another to begin to think about how those characters are represented and what kind of stylistic biases, semantic or formal biases, are associated with those characters. So for example, in a study we did on Hollywood movies that even some other students were involved in since 1970, we found that it's 30 times more likely for a South Asian character to reference a region in South Asia than a white character will in a movie. So what does this mean? What this means is that if you're an actor from India with Indian heritage, it's much more likely that you're going to play someone from India, right? And that ultimately you're going to be talking about India eventually as some reference to yourself in that movie. Now, sure, that may sound like, okay, what's the big deal? But what that means is that Indian actors are much more likely to have to play Indian characters. They can't just play any old character. And so you can see the way that representational bias continues to maintain stereotypes about identities associated with different ethnic, regional, national, and racial backgrounds. And so that's what we're talking about with representational bias. So here's an example of the way it plays out with gender in novels. So these are words associated with the description of characters. So we can begin to infer when a character is mentioned, language that character that is used to describe that character or that character's actions or the objects that character interacts with. And these are hard to digest quickly, but for example, women are, and then we not. Okay, so women are also much more cognitively and oriented towards interiority. Right? So they think, feel, know, want, and love much more. They're also much more social in novels. They're much more likely to interact with a character. So that's what that care sign indicates down in purple on the bottom there. Whereas men are much more associated with being embodied. So what's really interesting about this finding is that historically we typically think of the kind of gender hierarchy is that men are associated with intellect and women with body. They're emotional and sexual objects and so forth and so on. In novels, it seems when you can't see these people, it seems very important to emphasize men's masculinity through their bodies, through a sense of physical prowess and power. And so, again, the point is, these are these norms and dispositions that get reinforced over and over and over again, such that they're predictable and detectable, and they establish norms about group identities, which we may not want to continue to perpetuate. The last kind of bias that I'm going to talk about is what we call topic bias. So when particular topics, themes, or genres are associated in a predictable way with some identity. So an example of this is a project that some students in the lab did called Just Review, where they were very interested in the nature of book reviews and how that filters identities and authorial expertise to the public. Right? So many books are published in a year, and many are not read or many are not reviewed. Reviewing serves a really important way of filtering and prioritizing books. And so biases in the review process can lead to other forms of social bias or social beliefs. So, for example, we looked at book reviews in prominent book reviews such as the New York Times, which is still one of the most vibrant. I mean, they have an enormous number of books that are reviewed, so it provided a really good data set to work with. We looked at about a little over 2,500 reviews. And what you see here, again, the legend is a little bit occluded there. So blue is authors who are women, and orange is authors who are men. And what you're seeing here is the odds ratio, the likelihood that a book by a particular gender is reviewed in that genre. So, for example, women are over 2 times more likely to be reviewed when they write young adult fiction than men are, just as men are much more likely to be reviewed when they write books about science or politics or history or business. What you can see happening very clearly here is a division between fiction and nonfiction. Women are much more associated in the review pages of books with imaginary things, and men with fact-based things, factual discourse, scientific discourse. Interestingly, this does not translate into higher prestige in the literary world. So there's no evidence to suggest that women win more prizes or more prize money. They're certainly not on more university syllabi than men in terms of literature. And so what this indicates is that there's an association between authorial expertise when it comes to fact-based, non-fictional discourse and men. And this just makes it harder to associate if a woman author wants to write about science or politics, that there's an uphill battle there that these biases indicate in order to be perceived as an expert of that topic. And today is not incidentally, a protest day against bias in STEM and science in the university and in bias within the university in general. And we can see the way this gets projected out into the public and reinforced and normalized through this kind of data. Okay, so why is bias a problem? So I've been assuming it's a problem. I've been trying to show you examples of it, but it's important to emphasize and make explicit why you, as an individual or an organization, think bias is a problem. And here I'm drawing on work by Kate Crawford. She's given a wonderful keynote at a NLP conference called The Trouble with Bias. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. I totally encourage you to do this. It's very accessible. And what it does is it prioritizes, it sort of profiles two kinds of harm, what she calls two kinds of harms related to bias. The first is she calls harms of allocation, and the second is harms of representation. So harms of allocation is when bias leads to groups being treated differently in terms of resource allocation, right? And so an example of this that we can find in publishing was a study that showed that as genres have a higher rate of participation by women, the average price of books in that genre declines. And so if you look at the graph on the left, you see, first of all, 50% balance of gender is way out on the right. So everything to the left of that is biased towards being more dominant male genres. But what happens is that declining slope indicates that as women begin to participate in a genre, the pricing of books goes down. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate and book contracts and so forth. That's a different question. But it indicates that they're being allocated a lower slice of the price pie. On the right, you can see a study that we started to do that Eve was helping on, inspired by the novelist Jessica Shattuck, who wrote a book called Why Women Should Do More Literary Manspreading. And she was anecdotally looking and seeing that it looked to be the case that a lot of the sort of best long novels lists had way more men on them than women. And so we wondered, is that an effect that's still observable in the world today? And so when we took a sample of books on Amazon, about close to 6,000, we see that controlling for genre, regardless of the genre, the men's books are about 38 pages longer on average. And that when you go out to the extremes, that those numbers get worse. That men's books are about 2.3 times more likely to be represented in books that are longer than 500 pages. And for fiction, it's close to 3 times more likely. So her theory that men are allowed to, granted the permission, granted the space to write longer books within publishing, holds up. And that would be another example of a harm of allocation, right? It's not just price and money, but also space and real estate on the page. Harms of representation are equally important, and they go to this idea that we've been talking about here, which is, when a group is represented in a particular way, it maintains norms and perceptions about that group. And so, while Crawford doesn't talk about this in the lab, we use two kind of subcategories to help nuance this idea. The first is underrepresentations, the problem of visibility or invisibility. And here we take our motto from the Gina Davis Institute, which is, if she can see it, she can be it. And so if you're not represented, or if you're largely invisible in a category, then it's very hard to associate that category with that group. Underrepresentation in science, or as we saw in publishing, according to different kinds of genres, means that expertise and the associations we have about those opportunities aren't open to all groups equally, right? And so that's what the harm of representation is. It pigeonholes people or removes them from conversations. Misrepresentation is more the issue of stereotyping, when a group is represented according to strong norms that aren't reflective of the underlying diversity of that group. So the example there would be the way women are these kind of cognitive, feeling, and crying beings, where men are these kind of burly, physically embodied things on the page. These are ways in which these groups are being kind of captured in overdetermined ways and not capturing a range of possible options. So the final issue, that I want to talk about is what can we do about it? Here I'm going to recommend 3 things you can do right now to start thinking and addressing bias. And the first is start a conversation at your organization. As I talked about, bias is relative and perceptual, so it's very, very important that everybody in an organization or a unit has a shared understanding of what they mean by bias, as well as benchmarks and goals that you're moving towards. So to sort of hold yourself concretely accountable for addressing the issue. Addressing bias is about changing norms by creating new norms. The second thing you can do is get the right tools. And so this is where the work of my lab and tools like Granthinka come in, which is, as I've been trying to emphasize, data analytics can be a very useful tool for helping gauge decision making and pipeline issues and helping uncover those blind spots. So here's an example of a manuscript that's been submitted by Mr. Melville, which you probably recognize, which is why I'm using it. And on the left panel, you see some metrics that we can learn about this manuscript using Granthinka. First of all, the word count it's not the full novel. It's actually much longer than that. I just only put in a chunk of it. But what we can see right off the bat is that Mr. Melville apparently has very long sentences. While we don't have a percentile there, but we're going to. Your average novel today, the sentence length is around 11 to 12 words. So Mr. Melville is really pushing the boundary on readers' attention spans and patience. His vocabulary is probably a little too highfalutin and rich for a reading audience today. So he's scoring in the 90th percentile there. You might want to tone that down. We also see that Mr. Melville has a pretty serious gender problem. There just really aren't very many women in this book, so we see the ratio of male to female pronouns there. So for every 100 male pronouns, we're going to see about 6 female, and just underneath that, predicted characters are even more strongly skewed. So, if you're an editor, you might want to have a conversation with this author about the cast of characters that's populating this novel, or you might not. Or you might say, I'm going all in. This is a book about dudes for dudes. And that's just, I'll do other things with my list, but I'm not going to worry about it for this book. And that's what I mean about it being perceptual and relative. But data can give us a sense of the big picture and the local picture. We also see here that Mr. Melville is really interested in whales, which may be of interest, right? That may be a new market you're thinking about. Does talk a lot about God, which may be out of touch with today's readership. So these are things you can use to have a conversation with your author. Down below the slide, you can't see it here, but we can do this for the protagonist as well, for Mr. Ahab, and we can begin to find out how cliched and traditional is Mr. Ahab as a character. How much does it align with what we expect to see when we see a man as a protagonist of a novel? So to wrap up here and begin to open it up for questions, because that's really the kind of main aim here, is that, this idea of a conversation, is to aim for unpredictability. So this is, thinking about bias can often be thought of as like a checklist. Have I done this? Have I done that? Do I have enough of this, enough of that? And, in the lab, what we always try and emphasize is that this is a process about giving us nudges and impulses to be more creative and more open, right? To push against those habits, those norms that, whether conscious or unconscious, are kind of guiding our behavior. And the kind of data that I've been talking about with this tool, or working with us in the lab on things, these can be ways of beginning to open us up to being less predictable in the kinds of books we're commissioning, the content inside of those books, whether it's stylistic, representational, social, etc. And one of the kind of mottos we use is this idea of variance is power. The more variability there is around identities, characters, qualities, the more a group is empowered to be many things, right? The more openness and access there is around that category. The lower amounts of variance, the more pigeonholed a group is, the more disempowered they are to become different things, to have different opportunities, to achieve different things. And so we want to think about unpredictability as also a way of expanding variance around identity and representation. And so, as I mentioned at the outset of the talk, one of my goals in the last couple of years is not only to continue to generate some research in this vein, and all the kind of amazing student-led work that I've seen happen over the last couple of years, but also begin to think about tools and resources that we can put in your hands and that we can work with you on to begin to address this issue at your organizations to really, change publishing, to change the kind of stories we tell, which also will hopefully change people's minds and people's behavior. So that's it for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I have a handful of questions that came through my messages throughout your presentation. The first is, have you seen changes over time in bias, either in the types of bias or in the prevalence of bias in the work that you've reviewed?
It's a good question and a hard one. So getting really dense, what we would call diachronic longitudinal data is hard. And so we typically work with these time slices. So the data set that Eve and I were working with is a kind of cross-section of novels from about 2010 to 2016-ish. So mostly recent. And there we see all the expected biases we would anticipate finding. And so it's alive and well. Whether there's a kind of year by year, in the last 3 to 4 years shift, whether it's in television, so-called sort of visual media, or books, that's harder for me to answer simply because of the sparsity of data. This is also a conversation that we all need to have on another call, which is how can we work with publishers to have that data accessible to researchers to help all of us understand what's going on in books and make the public aware, become advocates, help readers become aware. Because right now it's very, very challenging to work with in copyright data, right? To work with contemporary data. And so I think industry, to be frank, needs to step up a little bit and think about partnerships. And then we can really begin to answer that question in a much more precise, nuanced way.
Excellent. Another question that came in is, what other areas of bias in literature do you want to research?
Good question. Well, we just did a project on Spotify, which was very interesting. So we're also particularly interested in kind of a range of media platforms. So while I focus in particular on books, we look at a lot of different media platforms, from television to music. We're doing a project right now on political speech, so trying to assess a little bit how people who have kind of conservative beliefs and liberal beliefs, how do they talk to each other online, and can we find not just biases but also modes of where they achieve common ground. One particular project I'm doing right now is a little more international, and so we often talk about this notion of cultural capital. So which categories, which types of writing are valued over others, and one of the things we're interested in is how that manifests itself at the international level and in terms of translation. So concretely, we're looking at, for example, if you're a writer from a smaller market country, smaller language country, what pressures are you under to produce a novel that may or may not be translated in the international market? And we are seeing very distinct signals that if you're writing in Paris or New York or London, you have much greater disposition freedom for particular types of fiction than you do if you're writing in Bulgaria or Estonia or these kind of more European peripheral countries that we're looking at right now, and we're hoping to expand that out to a more global perspective. But this idea of like participation, right? So what are the conditions under which you operate? Interestingly, in Canada, there's work to be done there about the relationships between English language and French language publishing, independent publishing in Canada versus mainstream publishing, and its relationship, say, to U.S. publishing and so forth. So I think that's a direction we also want to go to, because Canada, as a predominantly English language market, is also a small country market, and so we're curious how it plays out with respect to these other pressures that you see in small language, small country markets.
Excellent. I've got one other question that came in the chat while we were talking. let's say I am a textbook publisher, target group high school, and I want to analyze my content in a genre, suggesting history. And my purpose is to know, is our text written in a language that is too difficult to understand? So my goal would be to get you analyzing my content in order to rewrite some text so that it will be easier to read by persons with dyslexia and other readers. The question asker is asking if that is a service you provide.
Absolutely, right. This is exactly the direction that I'm interested in going in the future now, is providing exactly that service. So trying to balance research with advocacy and outreach and consulting, so that that's the kind of assessment we can do today, and we can begin to figure out matching readability, which can be measured in all sorts of ways, to audience expectations, to norms within the industry, and then also to begin to think about disability issues. I think that would be a kind of cutting edge question. And so, it would be an interesting project to work on for precisely that reason. I think we're very good at thinking about norms. So in general, middle school textbooks look about like this or something. But what would be some qualities of this content that would make it more digestible for particular groups with particular reading difficulties? That seems like a really interesting project. But for sure, we're at a minimum where we can already start addressing that issue. Definitely.
Perfect. Another question from the chat. Do you think that there can also be bias in the tools that you use to analyze novels? An NLP application may be trained on American English, for instance, and may fail to properly analyze the type of English that is used in other parts of the world, e.g. India.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So this is I would call it a wonderful field, but I mean, it's a very rich field of work, a lot of smart thinking going on about the problems. So it's not wonderful in the sense of what you uncover. So NLP tools, when we're using automated techniques to identify these issues, are themselves full of bias. So, for example, when we were doing gender prediction on characters, the first thing we noticed was that NLP has a harder time predicting the gender of the character for women versus men. That for various reasons of the way the data set's been trained, for the distribution of the characters, there are all sorts of reasons why. But the outcome is we have to do all this post hoc work to get our models, such as debias our models and get our estimates more appropriate, given that there's more error and problems in the underlying tools. So that is something that we're constantly working with and against. But there is a whole field that is really beginning to think about, how does the learning data, right, what we call training data, the learning that's happening through algorithms is incorporating all these human and social biases that we're finding out in the world. So there's sort of the opposite of a virtuous circle, whatever that would be called, that kind of can amplify these things. So you have to be very, very conscientious and conscious when you're using these tools that you're relying on inferences that themselves are biased. And so you have to create extra steps in your analytical pipeline to address those issues. So for sure, that's something we take into consideration and is a real ongoing issue that many people are working on.
Another question from our viewers in the chat. Do you think that this kind of analysis will help to minimize biases? I want to know about a practical implication.
Yeah, that's I would say it's $1 million question, but it's probably worth a lot more. It's a very hard question. Empirically, can we prove that if you change narratives, and if we change these norms, would we change people's beliefs? Would we change their behavior? That's right. That's hard to document at this point in time. My intuition as a reader, my intuition as someone who spent decades working with narrative, working with fiction, is that one thing we're certain about is that people are passionate about the arts. They're passionate about whether they're reading books or watching television. They're passionate about the narratives that they consume, and that those have a very profound impact on who they are and how they see the world. That's probably not too debatable an issue. And so the assumption is that if we begin to change the nature of those stories, if we put out other kinds of stories and other kinds of worlds and other kinds of people and other kinds of identities attached to those people, right, that our belief systems will gradually shift over time. There's no guarantee that that's going to happen, but we are in the very earliest stages of beginning to think about these issues and address them concretely. So we can't know yet, but the guiding assumption here is that narrative, right, fictional storytelling is incredibly powerful for human beings. And it's why all the people in the sciences are kind of beginning to realize that understanding the facts, say, about an issue like climate change is only half the battle. You have to figure out a way to communicate that information and communicate it in such a way that it changed people's beliefs and it changed their behavior. And what they're finding is that narrative storytelling is a really effective way to do that because, well, we've had storytelling a lot longer than we've had science. And so, you're in a very privileged position as gatekeepers and arbiters of the types of stories that get told. And so that's a very powerful position to be in. And I think while we can't know for certain that this will have an impact on widespread beliefs and behavior, I think it's a decent assumption to start from, that narrative is a very powerful social tool, and we should do what we can to create this idea of a more varied, unpredictable story space.